Okay, we are honored today to interview Dr. Michael Scheuer. He is a former CIA officer, and today we're going to be discussing a wide range of topics pertaining to the political situation in the United States and U.S. foreign policy. Mike, how do you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Perfect. Michael, I want to begin because you have a fascinating history behind you as a CIA officer, especially your time as the head of the Bin Laden unit. And I was wondering if you could begin by telling our viewers how you ended up in the CIA and about your experience basically at the agency during your 22-year service at Langley.
Well, I ended up there because when I graduated from university as an undergraduate, the United States, it was the end of the Carter administration, and the economy was terrible. There were no jobs. I was working as a crane operator at a factory in Buffalo, New York. And I saw an advertisement in the American Historical Association from the CIA, and they were hiring historians, which is my claim to fame if I have any. And so I applied, and amazingly, I got the job. And I worked there for 3 years as an analyst. And then for the last 19 years, I managed covert operations, including some in Afghanistan, and for 3 years against Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda.
So during your time, because you're most well known as the so-called bin Laden hunter at the CIA, I've read, and when we interviewed in 2014, you made this clear that during those years as the head of the bin Laden unit, you noticed that there was a reluctance on the part of some in the Clinton administration to fulfill the mission for which your unit was set up, namely to find and possibly basically take care of Osama bin Laden. Why was bin Laden so elusive, apparently, during your time as the head of the bin Laden unit at CIA?
Well, he was elusive because he was in Afghanistan. Had he stayed in Sudan, he probably would have been safer. But Afghanistan was a place that we knew very well. We had supported the Afghans against the Red Army for over a decade, and I had worked on that project for about 8 years. So it always struck me while I was there that both the seventh floor, the senior management of the CIA, and the White House, the National Security Council, and the president were deadly afraid of doing something, A, that wouldn't work, B, that got some civilians killed, or C, that they were just cowardly by nature. I didn't think the latter very seriously, but in terms of reasons for not to kill Osama bin Laden, the only reason there was not to try to kill him was you didn't give a damn what would happen to America. And so as I get older and I'm further away from it, I think I perhaps was a bit naive, more than a bit, while I worked there. Although I was a senior officer, I don't know how that happened. But I have the feeling that there was more to it than that, that someone wanted Osama bin Laden to stay alive. Certainly the Saudis did. And John Brennan did everything he could when he was the chief in the Arab Peninsula to block and delay and eventually terminate all efforts to kill Osama bin Laden. And there were 10 of them. So it's not as if we didn't have a chance. The chances were multiple. The chances were, some were iffy, some were 50-50, some were better than that. But it always seemed to me that if you're not going to take a risk to protect American lives, what the hell are you there for? And so as I've watched what's gone on over the past 4 years from what they call here now the alphabet agencies, I guess, CIA, FBI, NSA, more and more I feel like a fool that I didn't recognize that there was something more at play than just moral cowardice and the fear of not getting a further office down the line.
Right. Well, that's an important admission coming from someone like you, because generally speaking in the public sphere, if anybody hints even at the possibility of somebody in the American establishment or intelligence agency possibly colluding with the enemy for, well, for whatever reasons, you know, that's always labeled a conspiracy theory. You saw this firsthand from the inside, and I noticed that in a Hulu production from a few years back called The Looming Tower, I believe the title was, you were actually portrayed by one of the actors. I think they changed their name to Schmidt, I think, so it sounded more German.
Yes. Yes,
but
the author of that always wanted to be is Larry somebody.
Right.
He always wanted to be a Nazi, So
I see. That's very typical.
Yeah, he had a couple of FBI guys helping him on the script. One was a felon, the other one was Rudy Giuliani's poop boy. So, I wrote to them because I said, you're demeaning people who gave all of their efforts to trying to kill Osama bin Laden or capture him. And they said, we can do anything we want with a story. It's called poetic license. So take it for what it's worth.
Right. Well, that's interesting because you said, and in our first interview in 2014 and just now, and I think it's important that you repeat this, that there were 10 attempts to kill bin Laden in those years when you were head of the bin Laden unit, if I understand you correctly?
There were 10 opportunities, yes.
Right. Not
counting the fact that we were not tasked, the military wanted no part of trying to kill Osama bin Laden. The general, I can't remember what his name was, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, I'm not wasting my ninjas on guys who train on, kids' apparatus in a playground. So we had no help from the military. We did have 10 opportunities, though, to kill him using our own resources and assets. And that none of those were taken, sir. And I couldn't guarantee success in any one of them, but I can't guarantee success in driving to the mall in the morning or driving to the gym or whatever where I'm going. But it always came down to the one question of what if he kills a lot of Americans and no one has taken an opportunity to try to kill him first? And that's exactly what happened, and it didn't need to happen.
Right. So in essence, it can be argued that had your advice been listened to, especially on an operational level when we're talking about Al-Qaeda per se and bin Laden's role and stature in the organization, that had those efforts been successful at killing or capturing him, 9/11 would probably not have happened.
And probably not Iraq and probably not Syria. Bin Laden was the key to a whole bunch of subsequent events that lying presidents and secretaries of state and CIA directors have said we're all connected. None of them were. Mm-hmm. It was and I don't think it's really about taking my advice. It's more or less, CIA provides opportunities for the United States government to preempt enemies. And all they have to do is say yes. But if they don't say yes, the lives of the people who gathered that information that allowed the opportunities are often, we're at risk. And it's a matter of waste in terms of money, sometimes waste in human life. And the Clinton administration, John Brennan, George Tenet, Dick Clark, all of those people have the blood of 9/11 is on their hands. They never tried to stop it. And they took orders from the Saudis during that period and delayed operations and finally canceled them because the Saudis didn't want us to do it.
Right. Well, there's a lot of misleading theories, a lot of conspiracy theories out there on 9/11 that sort of, in my opinion, are misleading because in a way they point away from the actual perpetrators, and some of them are very loony, as you probably know. I've been following this for years also. One of the interesting aspects of 9/11, I think, and one of those that seem politically incorrect after many years of study and looking into the subject, is the possible foreknowledge of America's greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel, of what took place on 9/11. If I remember correctly, there was a report last year by an investigative reporter, Whitney Webb, where she reported on declassified FBI documents about the so-called four dancing Israelis in New Jersey, who later it turned out to be were Mossad agents. I was wondering if you could comment on possible Israeli foreknowledge or possibly involvement in 9/11 for our viewers.
Well, from a personal perspective, I would put nothing against, nothing past the Israelis if they thought it would help them. I have no knowledge that they knew of 9/11 beforehand, except what is in the paper. But their main goal in the Middle East is to make sure we fight their enemies. They're going after the Syrians. They're threatening to go after the Iranians right now. And the government that may come into place here in the United States certainly will send our troops back overseas to fight wars that are unnecessary. The two countries that you could never say no to in terms of passing information from the CIA to their intelligence services were the Saudis and the Israelis. Because if you said no, even if it was a good reason to say no, they would simply call the White House, and the White House would call and order us to do it.
Right. So it seems that the concept of blowback, which I believe the late Chalmers Johnston popularized very much, whereby the United States government many a times fights its enemies on the one hand and supports them on the other. And we know that in Syria in 2013, I believe the operation was called Timber Sycamore, whereby weapons were transferred from the dead Gaddafi's Libya to al-Qaeda insurgents in Syria fighting Assad. And I remember, I think it was Senator Rand Paul who said during a hearing in the Senate that, you know, it's weird that on the one hand we are fighting officially al-Qaeda, and on the other hand we're supporting their affiliates in Syria. Where does this logic come from? Because it's very mind-boggling to a lot of people who observe how the United States conducts itself on the international stage.
Mike, I think one thing that's very important for people to understand about the United States is we have a two-party system, but in foreign policy and increasingly domestic policy, unfortunately, we have only one party. And in foreign policy, the goal of that one party is always to fight wars overseas because it's a source of unparalleled personal income through graft and corruption. And it also allows us to please some of the people we want to, like the Israelis and the Saudis. The idea that America has a foreign policy that benefits America is absolutely incorrect. And we've seen that most recently here in America. We needed relief checks for victims of the
coronavirus.
Chinese virus, yes. And instead, they passed a couple of bucks for Americans, and they gave over almost $1 trillion to foreigners like Bangladeshis and Pakistanis for the studies of gender relations. So it's America is a mess. And unfortunately, all of the things that I saw when I was working now make a little more sense. And it's going to take a while for the American people to comprehend how corrupt, how compromised, how traitorous the American governing elite is and has been, at least since Kennedy was killed.
Right. Mike, while we're on the Israeli or Middle East angle, a fairly notorious backer of Israeli policy in the United States, one Sheldon Adelson, passed away yesterday. I was wondering if you could comment on Adelson's role in influencing U.S. foreign policy in a particularly pro-Israeli direction.
The influence of any wealthy Jewish American in the United States is a negative for the interests of the United States. They provide immense amounts of money to politicians in both parties. So if the Israelis say jump, we ask them how high. And it is a cancer on the United States. And I have to say, it's not Israel's direct responsibility. It's the direct responsibility of Americans who put Israel above themselves, the Jewish Americans who put themselves in favor of Israel rather than the United States. So they have American kids dying in the field for Israel, not for the United States. They're corrupting our politics, and they wield an enormous hammer because they control so much of the media. If you don't play the game and take the money and behave as a pet poodle, then you get hammered by their media, their publishers, their radio stations, all the rest of it. So, it's the old story, Mike. It's a cancer that's visible and spreading, and everyone who could do anything about it turns their face the other way.
Right. Just a quick comment. How would you respond to the fact that it was Sheldon Adelson who provided the jet to send Jonathan Pollard back to Israel?
Well, I was in favor of sending Pollard back as long as he was drawn and quartered, Mike.
Right.
It's not at all surprising. I'll tell you, Israel first is a big thing. And it is disease in the American system, both at the domestic level in elections, down to the local levels of elections, and in most especially in the crafting of a foreign policy that puts America first and provides protection for the United States, for Americans, and war only when a severe national interest is at stake. Freedom of the seas, for example, would be one. Israel would never be one.
Right. Well, I remember your testimony in Congress and how much you were basically hammered by the congressman on showing a rational objection to America's stated foreign policy. And I think the dictum of George Washington, whereby all unhealthy attachments to foreign entities, is something that I think every nation could actually apply, especially the United States, as we go on.
Like the president's farewell address is something that in America until the middle of the 20th century was read by every American student as they grew up. So they understood what the president was saying about foreign and domestic enemies and the combination of the two and how dangerous that was to the republic. They don't do that anymore. And of course, Washington now they're trying to make out as being some kind of a monster because he owned slaves. Well, everyone owned slaves around the world at that time. And there is no greater American. I believe he's the greatest American. And go ahead. I'm sorry. I don't mean to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because not only a slaveholder, but I think you could put him in the narrative, and some I'm pretty sure would do that today, that not only was he a slaveholder, but probably some, hidden anti-Semite, because he would formulate such, opinions on foreign policy that are relevant today.
Yeah, he was, I guess, seeing into the future. Yeah, he would. Yeah, now he would be an anti-Semite. Yeah,
exactly. Sticking just to the Israeli angle, just one more question on this subject, because we know that the president was very close to Sheldon Adelson. He was very much influenced by people around him, by the Israel lobby. I'm not really sure how much he actually believed in that policy, and maybe he actually conceived that he needed allies to some extent in order to sort of pacify the Israel lobby. But, it turns out that their demands are just growing bigger and bigger. But do you see any potential in the future from any of the potential politicians who claim to take Trump's mantle after him potentially, who might be able to show at least some objectivity in relation to Israel?
No, I don't. Because they can't get elected, they can't even get a spot on the news. I think, unless the president acts and uses the military to destroy what's coming in our country in the next week, the Israelis, well, Netanyahu was the first one to congratulate the corpse when they say he won the election, Biden.
Right.
And I think the president is torn a bit because his daughter is a convert to Judaism and her husband is a Jew. But I don't think that's the main thing. I think the president had a bunch of battles to fight. And the one thing that it would have united, and it might have swung the first impeachment against him, was to have crossed the Israelis. And so I think in the first term, he had to play well with them. And the stuff he did turned out to be important to the Israelis and not painful for us, surprisingly. The Golan Heights and the embassy to Jerusalem. I think if he survives this and gets back in power, what I have heard, the scuttlebutt I have heard, is first we need to take care of the Chinese, then we have to take care of their allies and their traitorous allies in the United States. We have to purge the federal civil service, and last comes Israel. I don't think the president is a fool. The president sees that so many of these wars were engineered because of a willing Congress to play the sap for the Israelis in return for money, campaign contributions.
Right. Money speaks. Money speaks. Mike, you mentioned...
Dylan said one time, Mike, that money screams.
Money screams. Well, yeah, in the American context, indeed. Mike, you said what's coming in the next week. What is coming in the next week?
Well, I've been wearing out my beads, Mike, praying to God that what we're going to have is a declaration of martial law or an insurrection, and the president will use whatever components of the military that remain loyal to arrest child rapists, traitors working for the Chinese or the Russians, all of those people who tried to burn down our country over the summer, and bring in military tribunals, as he has now demonstrated to the American people that the entire court system at state, local, and federal levels is corrupt, including the Supreme Court. So I'm hoping that there's one more rabbit in the hat, and that is retribution for the people who, for the past 5 years, have robbed this republic of 5 years of its life, for their own sake, for the sake of their foreign benefactors, and for their ideological depravity.
Would you say that Trump's policy, especially in terms of foreign policy, might have been a bit more successful had he surrounded him with more loyal personnel? I mean, I know that during the last few weeks after the election, or literally a few days after the election, he nominated Colonel Douglas Macgregor to work as Secretary Miller's advisor. And I know Macgregor before that was nominated to be U.S. ambassador in Berlin. And from what I've seen, Macgregor has been a very tough voice on the neocons, on everything that's basically bad in U.S. foreign policy, especially his interviews with Tucker Carlson. And I'm just wondering, I mean, if personnel is policy, what would you have advised Donald Trump to do in terms of picking people who actually want to implement, you know, the good instincts that he has in the foreign policy realm?
Well, I think I would have to say in that regard, Mike, that the president, his major weakness was not thinking or not being commonsensical or not being patriotic. His major weakness was that he worked for a living, and he had never been exposed to the day-to-day machinations of the corrupt people that are in Washington, who see wars as a way of making money for themselves and their future. I certainly think his picks were terrible in many cases. Bolton, for example, John Kelly. Although the president has done, just to step back for 1 second, the president has done an outstanding job in showing the American people the enemy, the domestic enemy. You know, there were two things that I respected most of my life. One was my father. The second was the U.S. Marine Corps. And we have seen now, over the past 4 or 5 years, many Marines, general officers, siding with the Democrats. And so John Kelly, you know, a famous man, supposed to be a great soldier, and he turned out to be a traitor inside the White House. And Mattis turns out to be another bag of refuse. And so many general officers. And, you know, I don't know why that is, except that I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big scandal at the Pentagon because they were buying aircraft parts to use in our military aircraft and Chinese drones to use in our battle forces. And once that came out, they canceled everything immediately. But maybe, who knows, part of the Pentagon and part of the General Officer Corps is on the take from the Chinese also. The Chinese are slow, steady movers. So they've been doing this for a long time. The president needs people. If he has a second term, he needed him in the first term, as you say. But he has to have people who are knowledgeable about neocons and Israel, but especially neocons. And he has to have people who will crack down on them. And they're out there. Lord knows. Rand Paul is out there. His dad's out there. There's a lot of us who served in the government and would be delighted to assist the president in crafting and installing non-interventionist foreign policy.
Well, in 2017, I remember I was ranting on Twitter, you know, why the hell are you making Pompeo director of CIA when you have Mike Scheuer out there? It seems such a very logical conclusion on my part. I mean, I've eaten basically all your books. I read your blog fairly often. I know there's other patriotic American CIA officers out there. Phil Giraldi, for example, who's also been very critical of the Israel lobby. But because of your experience, your knowledge of the Middle East, and the challenges facing U.S. foreign policy, would have been a perfect pick. But I guess, well, maybe then you wouldn't have gotten a ride to Sheldon Adelson's casino. So who knows? in that regard. Mike, I was wondering if you could comment on Biden's proposed head for CIA, William Burns. I've seen comments on the internet that this is one of those little rays of hope, apparently, that Burns might go back to what Truman wanted the CIA to be a real intelligence agency instead of a politicized arm of whichever ruling party happens to be in the White House.
I think that's more hope than common sense. That man has been part of the swamp for forever. The people around Biden and Biden himself, they're interventionists. They're suborned by the Israelis and now apparently by the Chinese. He appointed that other woman too, Victoria Nuland, who was the Ukrainian ambassador to the Ukraine for a while, who is a diehard neocon. And I'll admit it, Mike, it's a personal animosity. I have very little trust in American diplomats. I worked with them for almost a quarter of a century, and as soon as they get to a foreign capital, they become the advocate of that country, not the defender of the United States. And they will make up excuses. They will block operations. They will lie to the president about what's going on there in order to advance the interests of the State Department and their own future. So the last kind of stench I'd want entering the CIA headquarters in Langley is a diplomat as the chief of the outfit.
Right. Well, from our experience here, the outgoing ambassador, the outgoing American ambassador, Georgette Mosbacher, she was a political nominee. You mentioned that a lot of the American ambassadors who come to a certain capital suborn the interests of America to that capital. But I think in terms of Georgette Mosbacher, I think we could say that she was actually representing, instead of the real interests of real American people in Poland, she was mostly interested in expansion of woke propaganda. She said at one point that Poland is on the wrong side of the LGBT issue, on the wrong side of history, and she was very forceful in pushing the so-called 447 bill from the United States Congress, which basically would force countries like Poland to pay reparations, so-called reparations, to hairless occupiers of property coming from the Jewish side. This is a very contested piece of legislation in Poland. However, our president gave her one of the highest orders yesterday in Poland as she was outgoing. So believe me, there are politicians out there and presidents who are also more servile to interests other than their own countries than even some of your diplomats, I think. But that's just an aside.
Although your president might have just been glad to see your go. You know, here's your medal. Don't let the door hit you in the behind. But I would say,
go ahead.
You know, if I was king for a day, there'd be no more appointed ambassadors for the United States anywhere. Those political payoffs never work. They either, like this woman, following the Democrat agenda. Now, did the president know that? I don't know. Maybe he did. Maybe he felt he couldn't do anything about it at the time. But when you appoint fools because they're big money donors, you get bad representation. Either they are pursuing their own personal interest in a foreign country, or they're incompetent, one or the other. And I think the whole diplomatic service needs to be revamped. And frankly, I fear the CIA is should be in for an enormous reformation.
So what would this reformation of the CIA entail, Mike?
Well, I think it'd be from my perspective, we would need to get back, as you said, to collecting intelligence and leaving the military to fight the wars. The agency is not a war-fighting instrument. It's like the special forces. The special forces are not a war-winning instrument. We can do things at the edges just like the special forces, but war is about main force, main combat force. And too often in the bureaucratic battle, the things that the Pentagon doesn't want to do still have to be done, whether it's trying to dismantle Al-Qaeda, trying to assassinate someone. Stuff the military should be doing because that's their job, defaults to the CIA. Had they played a part in trying to kill Osama bin Laden between 1995 and 2001, they've got the toys to do it. Absolutely. They have the satellites and they have everything. But we should not be in that business. So I would make that a much smaller part of our operation. I think, if we can speak frankly, that part of the Obama administration's plan was to sow the agency, all government agencies, but especially the Defense Department and the CIA, NSA, with people who would be indebted to them forever. In the sense that when I came down in 1981 to be polygraphed, the polygraph operator tortured me and others on two things. First, on narcotics, are you a user? The second was homosexuality. And when I worked at the agency, you never would have heard of, National Lesbian Day or week. And now they have a month for LBGT glory. It's like having a month for depravity. Yep. So I would that's something that I could not tolerate, because no matter what people say, a sexual perversion, a sexual deviance, if you will, is always a source of blackmail by the Russians, by the Chinese. We say, oh, we've accepted it all and we're all together and we all approve of anything that goes on. Well, that's fine to say. It's just not true. It's not even true if you say it fast. But it's always a source of vulnerability to the person who's involved in the sexual relationship. So we've done so much to weaken the unity of the CIA organization, and it's been done deliberately. Brennan was sent there in large part to do that, to protect Obama's birth certificate, to get rid of people who would be loyal to non-intervention or inclined toward non-intervention. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's a couple of obvious things that could be done to make the place more united internally, to give it a more focused sense of purpose, and to not be the go-to war-making agency for a country that spends enormous amounts of money, embarrassing amounts of money on its military, which does very little.
Right, and I think it's also the ability to say no at some point. We know that Dick Cheney visited the CIA so many times that, as Clapper would later say, well, we were so engaged in the policy that we basically believed our own BS, in essence.
Well, that's exactly right, because I happened to be minimally employed during the Iraq War. I was on a kind of a punishment tour, and I was available, so they assigned me to do with a couple of people to do a paper on Iraq and Al Qaeda. And we went through 18 or 20 years of records. We found nothing. And that report, as far as I know, never got past Tenet. He kept it on his desk and no one ever saw that report. So, and I have to say I was wrong too. In my first book, when the paperback came out, I was able to recant an error on my part because I suggested there was cooperation there. And from all source intelligence, there was not a drip of evidence to say Al Qaeda was in touch with Saddam.
Right. Mike, in one of your books, I think it was Marching Towards Hell, you quote extensively from then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's when he was opining on the state of Western civilization. As a Catholic, as a conservative, as someone who sees the sort of broader strategic landscape, and as somebody who participated in the dealings of the Secret Service of the most prominent nation state in the West, where do you see Western civilization going in the next 10 years in terms of competition, not only with China, but also internal strife, economic and cultural?
I think that the people who are in power, whether you call them globalists or whatever you call them, are so distant from the populace that they're going to be surprised what's coming. If nothing is done We will continue to be the broadening sewer that is the Democratic Party in the United States and its allies. Sexual depravity, greed, minority rule. Biden said the other day we're going to send aid to small businesses hurt by the Chinese virus, except if they're owned by white people. They're trying to destroy our history, our statues, our symbols, our flags. America, for all its supposed cosmopolitanness, Mike, is a very local country in the sense that people have great allegiance to their hometowns, to their traditions, to their history. They always say, you know, and it's trite to say, you should not wake the sleeping dragon. And I think that's what's happening in this country. It's hard to tell in Europe, Mike, because our media has stopped covering foreign affairs, except when they can use it to embarrass Trump. We don't know what's going on in Yemen, for example, or in Afghanistan, or in China, really. The media has just stopped that function. And so watch in this country for a trigger is if they try to destroy the Second Amendment by legislation. I just read a couple of weeks ago, Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who attacked Pearl Harbor, said, be careful, behind every blade of grass in the United States is a man with a gun. And if you get involved with that kind of business, you're going to lose. And by God, you know, I'm an old man, but there'd be worse ways to die than getting your ass shot off trying to get rid of some of these people.
So true, so true.
And on your point, Colonel Ratzinger was such a great man. I think because of the media age we lived in, people had the sense that he was kind of a doddering old man. But if you read his books, he's a brilliant man, a brave man, replaced by a South American socialist. And I find that incomprehensible. I find the American church incomprehensible. And they don't stand up and object to him on gay marriage, on his interference in American politics. Mike, right. Catholics in the United States took forever to be accepted as true Americans. They were hated because of the Jesuits and the association with the French during the colonial period. They were always regarded as loyal to another power, the Vatican. Whether or not that was ever true, I think it probably wasn't, but I'm not sure. But through the Civil War, through the World War I, through World War II, we proved ourselves to be good and loyal citizens. And it seems to me from the start that Pope Francis has been eager to revive the idea that Americans are regarded by the Vatican as pawns that can be used to arrange politics in America. And it's not the case, except the clergy. The Protestant and the Catholic clergy in this country have behaved as cowards. They have allowed their churches to be emptied. They have allowed the suppression of the gospel. It is an astounding thing to me, but in other places, it would have caused a war already. Right. I fear that I think the Democrats have lit the fuse, and I think that what they will earn will be reaping the whirlwind, sir.
Well, there's no denying it that Pope Francis and Joe Biden seem to be buddies to some extent. We'll see where that goes. On the other hand, you do have courageous shepherds such as Archbishop of Vigano, who's really come out against the scum, so to say. Some call it the deep church, or the so-called the equivalent of the deep state and the deep church.
But the Cardinal has been, yes, there have been bright lights, and the Cardinal certainly is the most shining light of all, and the most powerfully convincing when you hear him talk. But there are too few of them. Right.
I think it was Ratzinger also who said, I think at one point in the early 2000s, that there will come a time when the Catholic Church won't be numerous, but the remnant that's left will be the most faithful of the faithful, so to say.
Yeah.
Although some are also saying that one of the good things about Francis is that attendance at the traditional Latin Mass has grown exponentially. So, as some say, bring on the incense, bring on the incense.
It has happened here too. The Latin Mass is very, very popular now. Even midnight Mass, and you know, a Latin midnight Mass goes on forever.
Oh yeah. The Kyrias never end. The Kyrias never end, indeed. Michael, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. It's a great discussion. I hope we can count on some comments and interviews from you in the future. You know that when I'm calling you right now, it's not the FBI. It's a trustworthy source. I wish you all the best in your endeavors, and I hope you'll see brighter days in America, just as we're hoping we'll see brighter days in Poland.
You're very kind to have me. I'd be delighted to talk to you again. And I grew up in a place called Buffalo, which had an enormously big Polish population, and I have a very, very soft spot because of that and because of the courage you showed against the Soviets. So if I can help at all, I'd be delighted to do that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. Take care and God bless.
God bless you, sir. Thank you.